Welcome to the Freight Project podcast, brought to you by Cerasis, a North American third-party logistics company providing shippers transportation management, technology, and solutions.
On today's The Freight Project podcast episode, I welcome Jaron Klopstein, VP of Motus Logistics, a reseller of Cerasis technology and solutions. On the episode, we'll discuss the case study which won Cerasis and Motus the SMC3 Logistics Management Alliance Award for 2020. We'll discuss two of Cerasis customers that Jaron was able to help solve problems for through the ideation of collaborative technology solutions, including not only Cerasis, but another freight technology provider. You'll hear about not only the solution, but also how shippers can best go about finding the right partners, solutions, and technology to achieve their long-term goals of reducing costs, utilizing resources better, and staying competitive. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Freight Project Podcast. Well, hello, Jaron. Thanks for coming on the Freight Project Podcast today. A long time coming. Excited to have you on and for everybody to hear a little more about you. And so with that said, before we get into the heart of today's episode, want to make sure that you tell everybody, what you're doing out there today in the world of logistics and a little bit about your background.
Thanks, Adam. Super excited to be here. Appreciate it. Always good to connect with you, man. To provide the listeners a little bit of background. So I'm a vice president at a company called Motus Logistics. We are a logistics sales agency and a solutions integrator, which is really just kind of a fancy way of saying, we've got a segment of customers who are traditionally shippers and they've got some challenges that they need to solve. And we work with them to get those challenges solved traditionally by finding a core group of logistics service providers or technology companies that can get implemented to help realize those solutions. So as a Cerasis sales agent, more often than not, Cerasis is a piece of that puzzle that we like to implement. And obviously, as you know, that's something that we've been doing for, I think about 5 or 6 years now. It's been going great.
Yeah, it's definitely been a real pleasure. And I think, from that outside view, and you and I have talked about this a little bit before, I think it puts you at a competitive advantage, even maybe above repping as a Cerasis employee. And the reason I say that is because, the freight broker industry, let's just think about that over the last decade. And although this has changed somewhat, I think over the last few years, just thanks to the great economy and just more competition and more acquisitions and consolidation in the industry, the freight broker has always been seen maybe as someone who's always trying to sell something to the shipper, right? Or advocating for more margin or maybe not even being transparent about that, and what's really great, and I'd love to hear how you think about this, you really kind of are looking for the best solutions, as you said, for, your shipper customers. You're really a true advocate. How has that played out for you when you're talking to folks when they kind of, maybe do they get that sense or what do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think your perspective is right, and I think the notion of a sales agent, especially in logistics and transportation, is one that has probably been commoditized and almost kind of made out to be much more transactional than anything else. I think part of that probably because of the nature of its involvement in the full truckload world, which is, by nature a little bit more transactional than some of the LTL relationships that we see get developed. But I think you're right. We early on as a representative or an ambassador of Cerasis and a lot of the solutions that we were implementing for our customers, I think we were worried about the confusion of, who is Motus and why are they implementing the Cerasis solution and why am I not just engaging directly with Cerasis to manage that relationship? And as we've continued to sort of entrench and intertwine ourselves as organization, I think a lot of that's become a lot easier. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we are an objective third party to that implementation. We are not Cerasis employees. We are obviously, like I said, very entwined with the organization, but it gives us a chance to be a little bit objective. Ultimately, if the Cerasis solution was not the best one to implement for that shipper or for that customer, then that's not what we would do. But, Cerasis is a great company and we just don't really bump into that more often than not. Like I said, that's a piece of the puzzle, and sometimes a piece of the puzzle that involves multiple service providers, such as, the case study that we're going to talk about today when we introduced FreightSnap to help solve some customers' challenges as well.
Yeah, and I thought that's, more evident. It's something you told me, but it's not just something you told me or you're telling our listeners. It's something you actually do. And I think it's really evident, recently where you were able to tell this story at Jumpstart 20. We were able to submit this story to try and win an Alliance Award in the spirit of true partnerships and collaboration. And we did. We won the Alliance Award thanks to your innovative solutions as a group. It's really fun to win it as a group, by the way, and there's a lot of awards for us to hold, and they were pretty nice awards. But, I think if you could, just for our listeners, kind of talk a little bit about that solution you brought in around FreightSnap and two of your customers, Texel and Flexhaust. And you really told a great story at the panel there, and I'd love for our listeners to hear the same thing. So what'd you do to have all those parties come together to get solutions that really helped your customers achieve their goals?
Yeah, definitely. So, in both instances, what it really came down to is how we could help a segment of customers that were predominantly shipping density-based commodities, kind of ease a lot of the pain and the manual processes and some of the back-end invoice adjustments and the variances associated with shipping those density-based commodities. Both of these customers just so happened to be in the manufacturing of industrial hose or duct hose. So they were shipping a similar product, and in the case of hose and tube, it's 100% a density-based product. So it could range anywhere from class 70 to class 300, and so obviously that creates a lot of unique challenges, both by way of processing the freight accurately and correctly, and then, like I said, just dealing with, the significant number of reweighs and reclassifications more than anything that you see, mainly being driven by the tremendous acceleration of acquisition that we've seen the carriers make in dimensioners. And so as we started to kind of bump up that, when I say we, I really mean us and Cerasis, because Cerasis is performing the audit on these invoices. We started to kind of shift our mindset of why couldn't we necessarily look to implement a dimensioner solution on the shipper side of the equation as well to achieve some of these benefits, kind of with our stated objectives being we want to accelerate the processing time. So the amount of time it takes to get from pick ticket to bill of lading, we really want to speed that up, right? And we want to take out a bunch of the manual touch points associated with it. And then again, on the back end, let's try and mitigate and cut down on reclassifications and reweighs as much as we can. So we went out into the market. We were looking for a dimensioner provider, a dimensioning solution provider that we could partner with, and quickly met the FreightSnap team. They're a younger company. They've been in business, I think, since 2013. And as a result, they really still kind of have that entrepreneurial thirst to just create new stuff and build new solutions and just whatever it takes, right? They didn't have some standardized process by which they had to do integration. They were open to pretty much anything. So we knew they were going to be the fit right away because that's the same perspectives that we get from Cerasis relative to custom development, even though, you guys have been in business for considerably longer than that. So we connected those two resources, right? The development team and the technical team from FreightSnap and Cerasis, and kind of plugged them together and said, how can we make this work? And realize that the best way to facilitate that would actually be to integrate the FreightSnap cloud application with the Cerasis Radar, with the TMS, so that customer could pull down that density information instantaneously, right? So the warehouse is scanning that freight, they're putting it under the dimensioner, they're weighing it, they're dimming it. That solution is capturing that information. It's basically cataloged by a unique ID, whether that be a pick ticket number or a sales order. And then it goes and lives in the FreightSnap cloud until the shipping office is ready to process that order, at which time they can pull it right into the Radar. And it's been a huge success. It's sped up the amount of time it takes them to process an order. It's cut down on the amount of back-end reweighs and reclasses we're seeing because the freight is being processed more accurately. But it's also making the auditors' lives a lot more straightforward when it does come time to actually work with the carriers to reverse those charges. We have just considerably better documentation now because we have photos of the freight on the dimensioner. And so our ability to sort of get resolution on those when the documentation and evidence supports it has really gone up. So it's been an awesome solution and one that we're obviously really proud of and looking to replicate moving forward.
Well, I tell you, it's a lot of moving parts to come and bring together. Yeah, so really thinking outside the box because that solution did not exist beforehand, and it started with the end in mind, right? And I think whenever you're building solutions for whoever, when it's based on the desired outcome and not necessarily a Band-Aid on a bullet hole, then you're typically going to get a solution that's going to provide the results you want to see. And it took a lot of trust from your customer and a lot of trust really in your teammates, our folks here at Cerasis, and trust in a new partner in FreightSnap to get it to work. And did you have anybody, you'd said that everybody was pretty down for everything, but did you come across any challenges from anyone to make all of these parties come together? And if you didn't, how did you build up that trust in order to get to the solution that led to more efficient freight process and those savings?
Yeah, like I said, we were pretty blessed. We were pretty fortunate because that mutual culture around sort of building the solution for the customer was evident. Obviously with Cerasis, with FreightSnap, and with us, and so right from the outset, everybody was just kind of this perspective of, great, let's do this. This sounds exciting. Let's get to work. Obviously, people from a technical standpoint love to build new stuff, and so I think they rallied around it right away. In testament to our customers, Texel and Flexhaus, they were all about this. I mean, and I think that a certain degree of credit has to be given to them because dimensioners on the shipper side, that's not an adoption curve we've really seen yet. It exists, but not nearly obviously to the extent of what we see on the carrier side. These aren't Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 companies that are adopting this new technology solution. These are mid-sized industrial manufacturers and in the heart of America. These aren't Silicon Valley tech hubs. So I think you got to give a little bit of credit to them just for their willingness to step out of the box and say, yeah, let's go for it. This sounds really exciting. Conceptually, we understand the benefit. We're willing to take a little bit of a leap with you and invest in this capital equipment purchase because we see the long-term, benefit curve of what this is going to deliver. If anything, I think one of the challenges that we had early on was just, again, you kind of, when you're building technology solutions, you want to build them for the customers you have, not the ones you don't, right? And obviously, we want to be able to scale that development work, and we want to be able to replicate it. And we want to make sure that because we're taking technical resources and developers and we're putting them on this, that we can take the dedicated time that they are spending on it and we can scale it so we can achieve a better ROI out of it. But having said that, I think that that's a little bit of a logical fallacy. Sometimes I think people get a little bit wrapped around the axle of trying to build a macro solution for a segment of customers that don't even exist and may not even have those challenges. Whereas, we obviously wanted to do that, but we kept the customer's needs in mind. And so we build that solution for the customers because these are very real customers with very real challenges that are looking to us for very real solutions. And I think ultimately we succeeded in that.
So you're not just a sales guy who's not closing deals and you look for an excuse to sell something else that you're not selling currently?
As much as I'd love to be the guy who just gets the agreement signed and then walks away, it's just not in my nature. I don't work that way, which I guess maybe spits in the face of the true perspective of a salesman, but it's a mold that I'm happy to break.
Yeah, you're definitely not that typical sales guy, that's for sure. And I think we're seeing less and less of that smarmy freight broker or car salesman, used car salesman. Today the customer is everything.
That's right.
It's not centered around that customer, a real customer who has a real problem, and it's not outcome focused. You're barely or typically not going to get anywhere. And I have a feeling that when you have other customers in that segment, because I think one of the key things is that it was density based freight, right? And I think that's what made it so apt to have a dimensionalizer. Because 80% or all of their freight? How much of their freight is dimensional freight?
In the case of Flexhaus, 100%. In the case of Texel, probably 95%. But even in the 5% that isn't density based, it's getting shipped on a pallet with density based items. So, it's pretty much 100% across the board for both customers.
Well, that makes sense. So then they had a very big incentive to make sure their DIMs are right, because who has time to deal with reways and reclasses? Nobody. And I think we're going to see more and more movement towards DIM pricing in LTL freight. Even if you're not a dimensional type shipper today, just 2 years ago, I believe, we went from just 18 freight classes in a table or was it 11? I forget. But then a lot of those moved over to a new dimensional, freight class model. And I think we won't get rid of the antiquated freight class model anytime soon, but it's going to be a hybrid. And if you can take an advantage of what the carriers are trying to do with what their profitability needs to see, because they care about space on their trucks. And we've seen a slew of bankruptcies with people not being profitable. So we're going to see more and more carriers trying to get their money back if you're not dimming your freight and you're wasting their space. So I have a feeling, as you said, that by building this for a specific customer, you realize that there could be other customers who can take advantage of it. And so will we see more? I asked the guy at FreightSnap that I met at Jumpstart, I said, do you have many shippers buying these things? And he said, not really. I said, what about 3PLs reselling it? And he said, not yet. And I said, well, that might be the next angle of where FreightSnap gets a lot of their business. So do you think this is just a one-off, or are you going to see more of it?
Well, I think, to touch on a couple of your points, I think you're right. I think we're going to continue to see an emphasis on density-based freight classifications moving forward. These two customers, hose and tube, we do a lot in the hose and tube space. It's an industry that we're a little bit entrenched in. And so we have a large segment of customers, both in manufacturing and in distribution within that vertical. And you talk to a lot of them, and it wasn't that many years ago that they can remember that they just used to ship all of their product at class 70. Now here we are, in 2020, there's 11 different freight classifications that it can ship. That's a very different reality that those companies are having to come to terms with. The way that they've dealt with that is different across the board. We have a segment of customers that choose to do nothing about it, close their eyes, and ship the product out in an FAK class and just sort of hope that it works. That's not a viable long-term solution. That's not a solution that we entertain or allow them to continue, so to speak, post-implementation of the Cerasis solution. We want to move them away from that. But certainly, I think you're right. Carriers are less inclined these days to care what about the product is and more about how much space it takes up on the truck. We saw what dim weighting meant for parcel in the UPS and FedEx world a couple of years ago, and I think you'll continue to sort of see that investment. But having said that, the FreightSnap people are right. I mean, it really is a carrier first acquisition right now. I think you will see shippers continue to invest in these, both because of the increase that we're going to see in the emphasis on density-based products, but just also because of the efficiencies that it brings. And I'll say that I don't think it's limited just to density-based shippers, because there are other benefits. I mean, you see solutions out there today that maybe are just freight imaging tools that are taking photos of the freight, or we even have a segment of customers that don't have a dimensioner, but they're taking photos of the freight with their cell phones, maybe uploading them into a computer, if for nothing else, so that they can prove to their customer or prove to the carrier in a claim situation that this is what the freight looked like when it left my dock. The dimensioner checks all those boxes. Not only does it dim the item, not only does it ensure that you process the freight more accurately, but it also captures that picture of it. Again, that's a huge game changer for Cerasis staff specifically, because we are responsible for supporting with the audit and the claim. But even a shipper independent of a third-party logistics provider, if they were managing those items on their own, that's a game changer just in terms of the documentation that you can give to your carrier partners, rather than just speculation or maybe antiquated information where up until this point we've had to rely on technical product sheets, a packing slip, and maybe a scale calibration certificate. It's just not the same level of credibility as photos of the freight on the dimensioner.
Well, it's all still in the pursuit of saving money, right? But it's also not a beat down anymore of give me the best rate carrier, where you're necessarily rate shopping all of the time, because that seems pretty inefficient too, and isn't a long-term way to really go about much in life. And so, I think, again, when we think about the history of freight, that's drastically changed, I think, in the last 5 years, faster than ever before, perhaps. I heard early on coming into the world of freight from sales folks that, that's all they care about is the rate. But are you seeing the pursuit of getting to lower prices a more strategic conversation of collaboration between carriers and shippers, and now intermediaries like ourselves at Cerasis and you guys through Motus, working with those parties around data and technology in order to get there? Are shippers becoming a little more mature in how they approach freight themselves?
Definitely, there's a tipping point. Obviously, at certain volume levels, there's a segment of shippers that they don't care about anything except I just need to get the least cost because I only ship a handful of pallets out, and I'm not really interested in this whole strategic aspect of my transportation because it's not a function of my business that determines success. Now, obviously, that's a small segment of the industry. Once you kind of hit that tipping point in size where the freight spend becomes, even just $500,000. At that point, half a million, million, 10 million plus, freight becomes a much more strategic function. And I think, you're right. There's always going to be an emphasis around the rate. But one of the things that we always make sure we spend a lot of time with our customers talking about is there's a huge difference between price and cost. These are not the same things. Your price to service a shipment to a customer is the rate that you're getting from the carrier. Your cost to service that same shipment is everything else that goes into packaging that freight, getting it out of the door, the amount of time that you spend on it, the amount of time you spend tracking it, the amount of time you answer customer service phone calls from your customer when it's going to be there, the amount of times you have to take antiquated data and merge it together in a single source, the amount of time you have to spend auditing it, the amount of time you got to spend paying the bill, fighting the claim, routing inbound freight from your vendors. I mean, these are all touch points that, for the record, traditionally impact much more than just the shipping department that yield a high cost of that item. And the dimensioner represents a great example of that. Customers are now changing their mindset to where they're willing to make a capital equipment investment that's out of pocket money, which spits in the face of reducing your freight expense in order to introduce an element that will help them carve costs and time out of their network and also enhance their visibility to their own information. In the case of both of these customers, they're looking for ways to find technology to speed up processes that humans have been doing manually up until this point. Because obviously the faster they can do that, the faster they can grow an organization without having to add overhead. Again, that's a very different conversation that you're having with a shipper rather than just, hey, what's my discount? What can you get me into a discount? Rather than, hey, let's use technologies to figure out how we can grow your organization and make it more profitable and use transportation and supply chain as the vehicle to accomplish that.
Hey, everybody, getting the freight and supply chain MBA from Mr. Jaron. I love that. That's awesome. That's really great advice. And it's nice to hear, as somebody who's so focused on the practice of marketing and, business development, it's sometimes hard to get that relevant detail that you see in your conversations on the day-to-day. And it's nice to hear that, it's getting a little more strategic out there. It's not that necessarily the desired outcomes are different in the pursuit of, being more profitable or anything like that. It's just that there's a lot more of them now and they're more nebulous and they involve other departments. The freight department or the supply chain department is no longer seen as a cost center. It's seen as a strategic and competitive advantage. If you look at Amazon's not really a retailer or a wholesaler. Let's be honest. They're a logistics company who sells products, and they actually, now they used to rely on other partners. They're now increasingly relying on their own infrastructure. So it's an interesting world out there, and Amazon's even brought it to the public's attention on how important supply chain is. So, but with all that said,
one point there, Adam, just to continue with that, the Amazon effect is one that I was going to mention, and I totally agree with you. This, retail and online commerce is changing the psychology around the way people look at freight costs, even in distribution and manufacturing. People are getting accustomed to this notion of free freight. We work with our customers regularly around what should your freight policies be and how can we maximize those to make sure that you're taking care of your customers while also not putting yourself at a disadvantage. But to circle back to that, you're right. Supply chain is now being perceived as a strategic function, and I think the important next step that a lot of people will begin taking is not just how can we carve costs out of our transportation function, but how can we use our transportation partners to gain a customer service advantage and to better service our customers. Again, you're right. You see that in Amazon. You see that there's a reason that they're opening a distribution center, next to every major population hub that they can, so that they can service freight same day or next day at worst. That's just not an advantage that a lot of other online retailers can offer. And even in today's age, if it takes 2 days versus one, that 1 day shipping is probably going to be enough to motivate me to purchase from Amazon as opposed to somebody else. So I agree with you, but I think that's an important point. And as we're educating shippers on how to think about these things, hey, I understand choosing this delivery method versus this one might be more cost effective, but ultimately at the end of the day, there's probably nothing more expensive to your business than losing a customer and having to replace them. So let's keep that in mind as we shape our transportation strategy going forward.
How about that? I think what you're going to start to see then is a bunch of these, folks in the freight at like your customers at Texel and Flexos. They're going to be well positioned to maybe be CEO or COO of the company one day. And I think we're going to see more supply chain people rise up to the top, sort of like Tim Cook did with Apple.
Absolutely.
Apple, why were they successful with the iPhone? Well, imagine if they had created all that demand without being able to deliver it very well. And I would say, despite the extreme demand early on of the iPhone, that Tim Cook in the days when Steve Jobs was the CEO did a pretty good job of making sure those phones got out to people on time. Because otherwise, that experience, which was pretty new when it first came out, would have been tainted, and maybe it would have a distrust in even the capabilities of the amazing iPhone.
That's right. I totally agree.
Well, okay, so we talk about good things. This is all awesome and positive, and collaboration and technology and getting the results you want to see and seeing the supply chain get its due as a strategic and competitive advantage. But as you talk to shippers, there's a lot for them to focus on, man. I mean, it's a lot going on out there. And shoot, now we have the coronavirus trying to come up in our business all up in here, man. I'm sure that's overhyped anyway, but we'll see. We'll see. It's not yet the outbreak that we see in movies, but that we all kind of seem to want in a way by the way we hype it. But as you're talking to shippers, what are they seeing down the pipeline? What are they worried about in the next 18 months?
Yeah, I think, truth be told, obviously it depends on the size of shipper you're talking to. I can tell you that I still think a lot of people, even in 2020, still have a lot of uncertainty around things like capacity. You mentioned early in the podcast that we're still seeing carriers go belly up and go bankrupt and go out of business. And I think that is counterintuitive, and a lot of shippers don't understand that. Well, if capacity is tight, shouldn't there be more business than these carriers can handle? Why are they going bankrupt? That doesn't seem to make any sense. And you can understand, why they reach those conclusions. So I think even here in 2020, that perspective that we really saw come to fruition in the beginning of 2018 as capacity really got tight, people are still worried about that, even if it's, as you and I know, not as big of a concern these days, and we know capacity is leveling off. People still, probably more emotionally than logically, they still ask a lot of questions about that. What's going on with driver shortage? What's going on with capacity? Do we need to be worried about that? And of course, you always need to be concerned about that. But I still think that exists out there. Outside of that, I think one of the challenges that's bumping into a lot of shippers these days is there's just an overload of information. And what I mean is there's an overload of buzzwords. There's an overload of providers out there. We're starting to see, and you and I saw a lot of these people at Jumpstart, and you'll see them at all the industry conferences. There are so many new providers that are popping up out of nowhere, traditionally technology-driven organizations that are more often than not trying to solve a very niche aspect of the transportation and logistics function. You see a lot of them in the last couple of years, Project 44, Four Kites, you're seeing now all the advent of digital brokerage and that sort of thing. So I think in a sense, it's great. That's a great thing for shippers. There are more options out there. There's more opportunities for them to find providers who can solve their challenges. But I think in some regard, it's a little bit overwhelming. And because there's so many out there, in some instances, I think it's actually making it challenging for shippers to find the providers that they need, because they get confusion around who does what. You're a TMS provider, and you're a subscription TMS, but you're an enterprise TMS, and you're a broker, and you're a managed services provider, and it's just you're a consultant. There's just so much out there that I think that's creating a little bit of confusion in the market. And then you start throwing in all these buzzwords like machine learning and AI and blockchain, and just if I'm a operations manager or a GM at a $30 million company, and I don't even have a TMS yet, and we maybe even are still handwriting our bill of ladings, that exists, just so people are clear. There's still people out there that are doing that. I don't know how to take that next logical step because, that next logical step, am I supposed to think that that's AI? That's obviously a little bit of a reach. I think that's confusing for people.
Absolutely. And I think us marketers have done a poor job sometimes at making something seem cool because we can get clicks. And, I think it's important that we keep our eye on it, but it's also key that in whatever we put out, that we say the truth, that, we go back to, this is an advanced technology, and yes, it's going to provide benefits, but the underlying fundamentals, if they're not there, this isn't going to work. It's kind of like, you haven't exercised in a year and you say, all right, man, I'm going to go out there and run a marathon today. Well, it's probably not going to be too good for your body either. And you might want to build up to that. Make sure you've got good eating, good water, sleep, done a few push-ups maybe before you go out there. I don't think that's going to help in the marathon, but you can't shock the system. You can't really do that to yourself. So you got to be prepared out there. So it's good to hear that, hopefully they're not too confused, but I've always said this myself. It's incumbent upon folks like us, like you at Motus and Cerasis, to say, here's what you really need to focus on. The quest is problem-free shipping. The quest is reducing total costs today and the environment today. And that we got our eye on it, but let me get you from A to Z. And I think that's why you're seeing more and more shippers. And, from your perspective, do you think that more and more shippers are looking towards technology providers like us and 3PLs? Are you seeing more of an openness to when you do a cold call maybe to a shipper?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that when the recession hit in kind of '08, there was an influx of third-party providers, and maybe a lot of them that didn't necessarily have the credibility to be there, but the barrier to entry was low. And I think that kind of drug the third-party logistics name through the mud quite a bit. When we were reaching out to shippers in 14, 15, 16, even up until a couple of years ago, it wouldn't be uncommon for you to speak to someone and have them say, we'll never use a third-party logistics provider. That's just not something that we'll do. And it was always a fun game for me to play because, whatever industry they were in, I would always challenge them back and say, well, let me ask you a question. If you had a customer who had a bad experience with one of your competitors, would you want them to write off your entire industry altogether? Or would you rather them have that bad experience because you could give them a better one? That's no different. Jaron. It's no different than what we're talking about here. Thank you. I appreciate it. But I think people are getting a little bit more open to that because now that the providers have leveled off, you're seeing a lot of consolidation and kind of strengthening of industry within the third-party logistics space. The top providers are kind of rising to the top, so to speak. And so, yeah, I think there's absolutely a greater propensity to it. It's nowadays, I think, even less common that we would find a shipper who has no third-party support at all. Whereas, 4 or 5 years ago, it wouldn't be uncommon for us to call somebody and have them say they were managing direct to carriers and that was what they had been doing for the last several years. So now, traditionally when you're calling on someone, they probably got a third-party provider or at the bare minimum, maybe one of the self-service subscription-based TMX like a Cubix or a FreightView or something like that. And I think that mindset's changing.
Yep, absolutely. And, we know firsthand about the consolidation of the industry here at Cerasis with the recent acquisition by Global Trans. So Cerasis, a Global Trans company. You'll start to see more and more of that, but definitely bring a lot more capability in the surface mode transport. But, I think for all of our listeners out there, if you're a shipper, maybe think about finding Jaron over there on LinkedIn or over at the Motus website to get to know a little bit about their company and what they do. So how can they find out that information, Jaron?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, hit the website, motuslogistics.com. If you fill out the contact form, it'll come right to me. So if you didn't like the things that I had to say, that's too bad. I'm the gatekeeper for the organization, or find me on LinkedIn. But we'd certainly be more than happy to chat with anyone. And regardless of what that challenge that you're facing is, we can probably find a provider to help you maximize it.
Yeah, they know some people that know some people. It'll be good. So thanks so much today for all of your really relevant insights, Jaron, on the ground, talking to shippers on the day-to-day. And thanks for sharing that really great story. It won us an award, but more importantly, it helped our customers achieve their goals. So Thanks so much, Jaron, for coming on today. And for all of the listeners of the Freight Project podcast, thanks for tuning in each week. We'll see you on the next one.